Okay, so my name is Dr. Helen Yaffe. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Glasgow, and my teaching and research focuses on Latin America and particularly Cuba. So I have two books about Cuba. The first was based on my doctoral research, which was on the economic work and ideas of Ernesto Che Guevara. So the part of the life least known about of this icon of the 20th century. And that was published as Che Guevara, The Economics of Revolution. And more recently, last year, I published a book called We Are Cuba, How a Revolutionary People Have Survived in a Post-Soviet World, which looks at particularly, it has a historical context. I'm a historian, that's my background, but it looks particularly at some of the quite incredible developments that have taken place in Cuba in the last 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet bloc. Looking at, for example, the development of the biotech sector, the expansion and deepening of Cuban medical internationalism, the energy revolution and the efforts to shift to renewable energies, the move the move towards sustainable development, and all these other aspects, and then a lot about political economy, about popular consultations, how decisions are made, policies, and so on. So yeah, that's quite a long introduction. Okay, so I went to Cuba to, last year I made a documentary about Cuba's response to COVID-19. In 2020, Cuba had an outstanding world-leading response to COVID-19. Unfortunately, they've lost control and they're subject to the surge now that most of the world has suffered from. So I'm making a new documentary. Maybe I'll hold back the announcement for another time. Anyway, so we were there working. Now, I had, on the 11th of July, I was leaving a quarantine hotel where I'd been staying on arrival, and drove through Havana to the house that I live in Cuba, and I didn't know anything about the protests until I was watching the Euro final football match. England was playing, and then in the half-time, the broadcast was interrupted by a speech live on television of the President Miguel Diaz-Canel with some of other leading members of the government, and he announced what happened. So the Cuban population were informed by the government that there were that protests had taken place in numerous cities throughout Cuba, and he gave probably, I would say, the most impassioned speech that I've seen him give at that point. He recognized, and I want to make this point very clearly, because there's been a lot of, since I've seen some of the manipulations and distortions about the account of what happened, he recognized that there were people out in the street with legitimate complaints, that life is hard in Cuba, that they are suffering from shortages and so on. But he also warned people not to allow themselves to be manipulated by forces, external forces, US-based forces, Miami-based forces, who were actually actioning a campaign, well-funded campaign, to implement or to foster destabilization in Cuba. And he ended with this rousing call saying, "The streets belong to the revolutionaries." And at that signal, thousands of Cubans went out in towns and cities all around the country with Cuban flags, and in support of the government and the Cuban Revolution, and in support of socialism. Now, subsequently, it became clear that much of the mainstream media was taking footage of, these hundreds and thousands of people and claiming that these were anti-government protests. So that was my experience on the actual day. I wasn't on one of the protests. I'm certainly not pretending I was. The next day, however, I traveled throughout Havana. I had just arrived. I had various chores to do, and traveled extensively on public transport and taxis and so on. And I have to say, it was complete calm. It was a tense calm, but I saw no altercations. I saw no protests. what I saw walking through central Havana and wherever I was, were, you know, when taxis were parked at the side of the road, they were tuned into a radio broadcast, again, of the President Miguel Diaz-Canel. And I think more or less every minister was rolled out to speak to address the issues of concern to Cubans, to explain what had happened in San Antonio, where the protests had possibly, I think, had started and they had turned violent. People were protesting because their electricity had been cut out intermittently over a few days, and they were understandably desperate and frustrated by that situation, and they were explaining in great technical detail. And you may not know this, but the president is an electrical engineer, so he took over from the minister in explaining the problems they've had with imports, that different types of generators require different types of fuels, and the problems that they're having accessing those as part of the impact of the tightening of sanctions by the Trump administration, which hasn't been reversed at all and has now been increased by the Biden administration, and recognizing the situation is hard, and explaining, what the government is doing to try and solve these problems. And every workplace we went past, walking through the streets, they were tuned into this program. So that was the response of the government, was a dialogue direct with the Cuban population. There was a violent protest that day on the outskirts of Havana. I didn't see it, but I heard about it subsequently. And in that protest, lots of police and also injuries to civilians and police. I'm not sure whether the signal cut out then. Did you get that? Yeah. Okay. So I mean, and then after that, there may have been sporadic outbursts, which it's very hard to know what was real and what was fake news, to be totally honest with you. The other thing worth pointing out is the internet connection was cut off, presumably, although they didn't say so, or if they did, I missed it, presumably by the government to stop social media in that immediate period from being continuing to be used to coordinate protests by people interest-based in Miami and or coordinated from Miami. So I was, for a few days, I didn't have access to what was being reported internationally and in the mainstream media, but I was speaking to people, and obviously it became increasingly clear. And by Wednesday, I reconnected, and it became really clear that there had been this incredible, some of it orchestrated, some of it just, the habit of the mainstream media and regurgitating material, had been this incredible exaggeration and manipulation of what had happened. And I can give you many examples. I think most of them are, many of them have now been exposed, and there's experts out there doing the work. But the point is, once you put those first images and relay the information, people have moved on by the time there's a corrective. But for example, there was a photo of a protest in Egypt from 2011, because Egypt has a Malecon, same as Cuba, seawall. And that was, with tens of thousands of people, and that was, circulated, and including by key figures in the Cuban opposition who have big followings on Twitter and so on, as if it was a protest in Cuba's Malecon. The same happened with the 11th of July, the day of the protest in Argentina. They won the America's Cup, and thousands went out and celebrated. That was also circulated. Even protests in Spain, I believe, of people being evicted, or a protest against eviction where people were severely beaten. Those were, circulated as if they were from Cuban protests. And one of the most shocking things that I saw this first on the internet, a policeman entering a home, and then you hear, to arrest someone, and then you hear, I'm upset with her child, and then you hear shots and see a pool of blood on the floor. And it was claimed that the police had just barged into someone's home and shot this man. Some said shot dead. Subsequently, this was shown on Cuban national television in their program after the news, and they, went through the steps of the video. And first of all, they showed that this man had the person who had been arrested had taken part, played a role in throwing bottles or vandalism, violence during the protest. But secondly, they showed footage of him after the policeman had gone into the house, calmly walking towards the police car with handcuffs on and no visible signs of injury. And then he was interviewed at his home 3 days later, saying, no, I was held, I was questioned, I was detained, and now I'm released. I'm back at home. It's Wednesday or Thursday, whatever day it was. So, this incredible, and the tweet that I saw of this image had 34,000 retweets. So this is the kind of thing that was obviously happening outside. I was getting messages from people, are you okay? And really, after that initial protest, which, as I said, sitting in a barrio in Cuba, I saw nothing of it. There were no signs of any other protests. Doesn't mean they didn't happen. Doesn't mean there weren't altercations. But the overriding environment was, people just carried on as normal. And when I say carried on as normal, they carried on also with the daily struggle that Cubans are being subjected to, which is very difficult life. The home that I stay in, people will have to get up at 3:30, 4:30 to get into queues for shops or distribution centres that possibly the goods don't even come in till 10 or 11. So that's 8 hours of queuing before maybe going to work or caring responsibilities and so on. So, what would happen if you can say, well, why are these queues? Well, the queues are there because the government is making sure that a shrinking set of resources is reaching everyone in the population. In a sense, they are fairly distributing shortages. But if it wasn't for that system of distribution, what you would have, leaving it to the market, you'd have prices going up, and essentially a very diminishing number of people would be able to get what they needed to survive, while, and people who are receiving money, particularly from outside, although that's become almost impossible. The Trump administration has made it almost impossible for Cubans to receive remittances and to use the international financial system to get goods off companies. I mean, during the pandemic, Cuba has been unable to import medical ventilators for its ICU units. And for those that it already has, it has been unable to import spare parts because the Swiss companies that sold them to Cuba have subsequently been bought out by a US company or US subsidiary. And now they are struggling in the same way with syringes and with the other, cheap products that have produced all around the world that they need to carry out their mass vaccination campaign. So it's a very cruel situation where Cuba can, on the one hand, lead Latin America and the Caribbean, the only country with domestically produced vaccines, which is standing up with very good results in the face of the Delta variant and 10 other strains they were tested against that were circulating in Havana when they carried out their clinical trials. But at the same time, they are relying on the international solidarity movement to collect money and purchase syringes and other things that they need to help them vaccinate the population. So this is one of the myths of how to say it. There's a very conscious policy to develop a doctrine that the problems in the economy in Cuba are a consequence of mismanagement and negligence by the Cuban government. Well, there's two things to say about that. First of all, you can't measure what Cuba does, its institutions, its social relations, its form of organization against a capitalist country and say, well, it doesn't do these things the way we do and therefore it fails. You can, but you'll never understand Cuba. The first thing is to say that Cuba is a socialist country and it has a socialist development model. And that means that it doesn't prioritize, for example, raising GDP or making a small elite wealthy and all the rest of it. So their concerns are always about the resources that they have and the fairer distribution and the human welfare. And they will make decisions and implement policies that are sometimes to the detriment of economic growth, but maybe preserve that fundamentals, what they call the conquests of the revolution: free healthcare, free education, and 96% of Cubans own their own homes. If they have to pay rent, it can't be more than 4% of income. Access to culture, art, sport, and so on, right? All those things for the people as they perceive it. So, that is the first thing. They are not trying to follow a capitalist development model, and they have a different standard of what well-being means. That's the first thing. The second thing, and I studied this through, learning about Cuba myself, reading English language academic texts. There is, institutions set up in the early days after the revolution to, with a political agenda, to disseminate negative information about Cuba and how it functions, and to, misinterpret figures and so on, to deny the achievements of the Cuban Revolution. And that's really one of the motivations for writing my own book, because there was so much going on in Cuba which is quite extraordinary and beneficial, not just for Cubans, but globally, that is under the radar, that is not recognized because it doesn't fit in with that predominant paradigm of Cuba, Fidel, and then Raul, the Castros dominate all decision making, or they were satellites of the Soviet bloc and then dependent on Venezuela, and that there's no civil society, there's no discussion, it's a dictatorship, there's repression. The mismanagement of the economy has meant that Cuba is poor, and so on. So, it's a very overpowering, dominant paradigm. But there are people who are trying to actually research Cuba as a country and see what it is that really goes on, and what the motivations are. I would just add that Cuba has met most of the UN's sustainable development goals that are non-economic, and yet it's not upheld as a development model. So that creates an interesting political contradiction that we need to study really to appreciate why that happens. Well, essentially, as Fidel Castro said in a speech in 1961, the US has never forgiven Cuba for carrying out a socialist revolution on its doorstep. And, the Cubans kicked the US owners out. They, completely changed the institutions, the political structure. I teach Cuban history, and it is quite phenomenal how much power. The most powerful person in Cuba was the US ambassador, or the person that the president of the United States sent to do his dealings. And the Cuban economy was dominated by the relationship with the United States, exporting sugar, with all the problems associated with the sugar industry and the legacy of slavery and the embedded unemployment, inequality, and so on, racism of that system, and dependent on importing food from the United States, and so on. So, the Cubans came along, this rabble of the rebel army and the civilian groups, and they overthrew the US control, and that was the threat of a good example. And we saw, I also teach on Latin American history, and you can see the immediate impact that the Cuban Revolution has on movements and discourses among the left in Latin America about what is the correct way to carry out a radical social transformation. So it's a threat to the United States, even if you discount the value of their properties at that point, which they have never done, because of the example of showing that, you can actually achieve sovereignty and real independence. So the United States punished Cuba with the sanctions, but the sanctions have always been part of as they have even reiterated recently, a set of tools that they have to help to achieve regime change in Cuba, because ultimately that is the objective. In fact, the US representative, I think it was June the 23rd, in the United Nations General Assembly, when they had the most recent vote on Cuba's motion to condemn the US blockade, the US representative said, sanctions are one of a set of tools. So that we have to pursue our interests in Cuba and so on, as they describe it, democracy promotion. But this is, let's be clear, their democracy promotion is the promotion of capitalist democracy. And if you look at the statements and the legislation behind the blockade, it makes it absolutely clear this is about free market capitalism as much as it is about having two parties or any other aspect like that. So the United States has never forgiven Cuba for the Cuban Revolution. But the other aspect is that the wealthy Cubans who left and went to Miami formed a very powerful community which accumulated major political leverage. It's a sort of just a weird fact of history that Florida is essential and decisive in US presidential elections. So the power, the sort of powerful elite in Florida have leverage over government policy. And what has happened, what has tended to happen almost exclusively throughout these 62 years, is that the US president has more or less delegated their Cuba policy to these powerful so-called Cuban American power brokers who, and there's a journalist like Anne-Louise Bardac, US investigative journalist, has shown very clearly how these Cubans have, like Jorge Mascanosa, who set up the Cuban American National Foundation, have essentially served as kingmakers. Their decision to switch to Clinton in the 1990s was absolutely decisive in his presidential victory. So, why did they switch to Clinton? Because Bush did not want to approve something called the Helms-Burton Act, which made the US sanctions what we call extraterritorial, so that they weren't a bilateral issue that affected US citizens and US entities, but actually interrupted and blocked Cuba's trade with Britain, Europe, Africa, Asia, Latin America, with the entire world. And Bush was hesitant about passing that. Clinton said, vote for me, and I will approve this bill. And on the same day that he announced that, he received hundreds of thousands of US dollars. So it's this powerful, diminishing in size and in proportion, a powerful elite in Miami and Florida who have influence over US policy. They have captured US policy. And in recent years, yes, but particularly in the last few months, there's been a growing movement of Cuban Americans in the United States who are demanding an end to sanctions. They are demanding a return to, at least a return to Obama's rapprochement, improvement in relations, and they want to be able to send remittances to their families. They want to be able to visit their families. They want to have a normal relationship with their families. They actually want to be able to live in the US and then go back to Cuba, and the other way around, which is the situation for most of the world. Because, the Trump administration eliminated, yes, we know, cruise ships, but he also eliminated charter flights. So Cubans in the United States and elsewhere haven't even been able to go and visit their families. So it's really, talk about cruel and inhumane treatment. But that is the point we got to under the Trump administration. I mean, I just want to say, reading back a bit, there is a misconception that Obama eliminated the US blockade, and he didn't at all. What he did is use his executive authority to issue some licenses and allow a few companies to operate with or in Cuba, and allow a few exchanges to take place. There was more progress in terms of diplomacy and changes, but very limited in the economic sphere. And it made it very easy for Trump to reverse all of these. Trump was convinced by his advisors that he needed to win Miami in order to get re-elected to presidency. So he squeezed Cuba with 243 new actions, sanctions and measures against a country that has already faced 60 years of sanctions. You know, so if you'd have asked me, and I think many other people who watch Cuba, you know, how could the blockade be tightened? I mean, you know, we wouldn't have even been able to come up with that quantity of measures. But everything that Cuba, every single workaround that the Cubans had developed, for example, using something called U-turn transactions in the financial system, they were all eliminated. So that's why you see the economic situation deteriorating. And this doesn't start with COVID. This starts before that. So this starts in sort of in spring 2019, they implement something called Title III of the Helms-Burton Act, which allows US interests, US citizens, and this whole question of citizenship is an anomaly because people who were Cubans in 1960-61 have claimed US citizenship, and this law applies to them retrospectively. They can take to court any foreigner who traffics or engages with Cuba in properties that they can claim were theirs, or that were their families or their grandfathers and so on, and sue for millions. So that was implemented in spring 2019. Then they threatened to fine oil tankers taking oil from Venezuela, and then fine the insurance companies, and then the insurance companies. So, you know, suddenly there was, like during the special period of the 1990s when the Soviet bloc collapsed and oil imports went from 13 million to 1 million, you know, in a couple of years, suddenly there was an externally imposed crisis, a sudden shortage. And, you know, that affects food coming in. And, you know, when there's no oil that's planned and it's in the budget, then you have to buy on an international market at much higher prices from a country that will charge higher because there's a risk of, you know, punishment from the US. So the situation already, I would say 2 years ago, Cubans were seeing major shortages, and these queues, exhausting queues, were already forming. Then you compound the situation with the pandemic. So Cuba closes its borders. Its second most important source of revenue is tourism, and they do the sensible thing from a sanitary or epidemiological point of view. They close their borders, but you know, where is their revenue coming from? This is a country that has to buy a lot of goods, you know, food imports and so on the international market at rising prices because there's a risk premium and all the rest of it. So the situation is imposed externally initially, and then from the pandemic. And, you know, the Cubans have, as I said, you know, we made a documentary about this last year. Their response in 2020 was outstanding, but they have used massive resources, all of their reserves essentially on responding to COVID-19 in the most effective way possible. Now we see major shortages of basic medicines, paracetamols, antibiotics, and, you know, the plant that they have to produce oxygen has broken down from overuse. And the problem with Cuba is the blockade stops them getting new equipment, it stops them getting spare parts, even when there are sellers and there is money to do so. It's an interesting question. So in my book, you'll see I deal with this question in the sense that I talk about how the blockade is extraterritorial, right? Now, that's illegal. There is a law, for example, in Britain, and I invite you to do the research for Germany. A law was introduced in 1996 in Britain saying that it's illegal, it's a finable offence to US national legislation against British citizens and entities. The European Union did the same. So Germany would have it by default of being part of the European Union. The United Nations urged every country around the world to pass legislation. It's called blocking legislation so that this US sanctions against Cuba would not be applied. Now, if countries would actually stand up and you know, take legal action consistent with their own constitutions, with their own legal systems, then the blockade of Cuba would be diminished overnight. And I've talked to in Havana, they call him the EU ambassador in Havana. And I said, this legislation is there, right? And allowing the US to fine and threaten companies in Europe and individuals if they want to do business with Cuba. I mean, that is a violation of EU laws. Why don't you do something? And he said, you're right, and we should. And it's clear that the US blockade of Cuba is the biggest obstacle to Cuban development. However, Cuba accounts for something like 0.1% of our trade, or maybe slightly more, compared to the United States, which is, more like 50-60%. So that is the issue. What would be effective if there were serious and significant movements in every country to demand that their national legislature, their national politicians, actually were consistent with their own laws, then the US blockade would be hugely diminished. And Cuba could carry on trading with the rest of the world. There's a big campaign at the moment organized from the opposition in Miami in the US to say, what's the problem? The US blockade only affects trade with Cuba and the United States. Cuba can trade with hundreds of countries, and it's a lie. So we need to be clear about that and investigate why can't they.